Welcome everybody to the CHEPS webinar. This is the second webinar that CHEPS is organizing. And maybe I should say what CHEPS is. This is one of the projects, the Big Idea Challenge project sponsored by the OU Vice President for Research and Partnerships Office to look into large important problems for the economy, the society, for this country and the world. So the CHEPS goal is to employ a convergence type of approach to investigate energy transition and decarbonization. And we're focused, as the acronym says, on carbon-free hydrogen production and storage. And we're very happy to have today with us James Mackey, who's going to talk to us about the economics of this and the side of the investors. And then Firat is going to do a more formal introduction of Mr. Mackey. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. We are very excited to have James today. James Mackey is the Managing Director of Project Capital for OGCI Climate Investments, and he's leading the team responsible for investing in real assets that recycle and store greenhouse gas emissions from large industrial facilities. James has a long career in renewables, and including solar and wind. So we are really excited to have him here to talk about hydrogen, but also about the future of the renewables and various challenges. James holds an MBA from the University of Virginia, Darden School of Business, and a BA in economics from Trinity College. Being an econ faculty myself, I am really excited to have him here. So without further ado, James, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Great. Well, thank you very much for the kind introduction. I'm delighted to join you today. I'm really excited about the work that you're doing at the University of Oklahoma, and I appreciate the opportunity to speak with you today. Just so that, for the benefit of the audience, I do not have a background in oil and gas production, which is a little bit unusual for someone who is looking at carbon capture and hydrogen production and industrial applications. But my background is more in investments and project finance, and I found my way to my current role because the energy transition is developing along very similar commercial pathways to what we have seen in other energy transitions over the past several decades, including if you go back to the original days of unregulated power generation, unregulated natural gas, and then renewables, which were built on that. And we're seeing a lot of the same things in energy transition, whether it be with hydrogen or carbon capture sequestration, even using very similar incentives to what we've seen to spur new technologies such as renewables. So as Dr. Demir described, I am more on the finance side, not a technical person. I'm not going to talk about the science of hydrogen, but I'll give you the perspective of someone who's looking to deploy capital into these sectors. And what is important to me and my investors in terms of supporting new advances that are going to be both sustainable from a carbon reduction point of view, but also economically attractive, because our firm is an impact fund, but we are very adamant in our belief that we can only generate real measurable impact with solutions that are financially attractive to attract more capital. So I am going to share my screen for a presentation. I have not a tremendous number of slides prepared, but I think enough to take up maybe 15 or 20 minutes, and then we can have a Q&A session. So give me a moment to get my share started. Okay. Is everyone seeing my screen now? Terrific. So in terms of the agenda, what I'd like to discuss today, I'll do a few minutes just on my firm, OGCI Climate Investments, talk about the scope of the hydrogen economy, particularly from our perspective as an investor. We'll talk a bit about some of the challenges in a true scalable adoption of hydrogen into the energy economy, and then we'll certainly talk about the best applications for carbon abatement, which is an important element of what we do in our investment mandate. And then we'll kind of wrap up with some of the areas where I think we can make some of the biggest difference economically in the near term. So beginning with my firm, OGCI stands for the Oil and Gas Climate Initiative. So the initiative is a collection, it's a collaboration between 12 of the largest oil and gas producers in the world. Collectively, they account for somewhere approaching 35% of global oil and gas production. And the mission of the initiative is to lower the carbon footprint of the energy industry through collective action and coordination. The OGCI was formed in 2015, and then in 2017, OGCI Climate Investments was formed. So whereas the initiative is not a legal entity, it's really just a collaboration led by the CEOs of those companies. In 2017, they formed a private equity fund, called it OGCI Climate Investments, and it has $1 billion, a little bit more than $1 billion of capital that's been committed to our mission of advancing new technologies and projects to decarbonize not just the oil and gas industry, but really all hard to abate sectors. Oops, gone too far. In terms of where we focus our time, if you look at the total man-made emissions of CO2 equivalents, approximately 50 gigatons per year, and roughly 75% of those fall within the mandate of the investments that we pursue at OGCI Climate Investments. So we're not pursuing agricultural abatement schemes, mostly because there's plenty of capital that's pursuing that. Our expertise is more along the lines of heavy industry, transportation, energy, the built environment. And we approach that through three primary pillars to our investment mandate. The first is reducing methane emissions, primarily through the upstream and midstream sectors. Reducing carbon dioxide emissions, which includes energy efficiency. And then the final one is carbon capture, usage, and sequestration. So one thing that we talk a lot about as investors is the time value of money. Those of you who are in finance know what I'm talking about when I say the time value of money. I want to take a moment to talk about the time value of carbon. This is a graph that's really very important to us because this illustrates that near-term action is really critical for achieving the goals that we have in terms of achieving a 1.5 degrees Celsius pathway coming out of the Paris Accords. So looking at this graph, this red line, this is where we are today in terms of global emissions. This yellow line is what this is what is needed to reach the 1.5 degrees Celsius level. The bad news is that these two lines in the middle, these account for basically all of the commitments thus far globally in terms of abatements. So in terms of what has already been committed, we're not even halfway there. So that's something that is troubling, but we're seeing more and more action from the private sector and the public sector to deploy more technology and capital. In terms of the time value element, essentially we need to increase the amount of incremental reduction of CO2 equivalents by 10 gigatons per year every decade. So if we look at 2035 and say, all right, by 2035 we need to be reducing 35 gigatons a year. Well, if we don't get there and we only make, say, 20 by 2035, well, then for 2050 we don't need to be doing 44. We're going to have to be getting all the way to 50. So the point really is that action today is really important, and I'm going to keep coming back to this during my discussion, because informing our investment mandate, we not only focus on the gross amount of carbon that we can reduce through our investments, but the timing of it. There are some investors that are doing moonshot investments into technologies that have the potential to reduce 0.5 gigaton of CO2 equivalent by 2060, and that's fabulous. We're glad they're doing that. We are focused on what can be done by 2030, by 2035, so that we're not too late when those moonshots become viable. So switching over to hydrogen, some of the drivers and benefits that we talk about, because hydrogen's been around for a long time. It's not new. It's something that's been produced for quite some time, but certainly it's getting a lot more attention over the last couple of years, and that's for a number of reasons. In terms of the realization that it can be viable for reducing carbon emissions. Costs are coming down for producing it, both in terms of the energy content that is needed to go into producing hydrogen, as well as some of the methodologies that are becoming more viable for producing hydrogen in a clean way. Of course, this is something that governments are viewing as one of many solutions towards reducing global carbon footprints. So it's being built into incentives, in the United States and across the world. And finally, there's plenty of alliances that are coming together on not just the production, but the industrial application of hydrogen. So some of the graphics I'll have in here are from some trade associations such as the Hydrogen Council, but even industrial companies that historically have not been as focused on carbon abatement, such as Hyundai Motors. They are really touting the advantages of hydrogen, both in terms of the demand creation, the CO2 reduction, and looking out to 2050, millions of new jobs produced. So of course we know that hydrogen, it's challenging. So there's all sorts of reasons why this is a challenging transition that requires not just capital, but a lot of coordination amongst a really complex value chain. First of all, you've got the entrenched incumbents that existing hydrogen production, for the most part around the world, it's really dirty. Most hydrogen that's produced today around the world, the majority of it is produced through coal gasification without any capture of the CO2 that is produced during that process. By coincidence, I got a news alert this morning on my phone, and the headline was basically how hydrogen production is 11 times worse for the economy or for the environment than CO2 by itself. Dig into that article a little bit. There are a lot of assumptions they made, but the basic premise of the existing techniques that are employed today for producing hydrogen, they need to come a long way for this to truly be a low carbon solution on a full systems basis. But that's something that we on the investment side, and I think probably everyone who's participating in this call today, are really committed to achieving. Other challenges, of course, it's expensive. That's something that can be addressed with scaling. Coordinating generation and supply and demand. That's actually something that I think is quite important as an investor. I have dozens of investment proposals that come across my desk every week, and probably half a dozen every week have something to do with hydrogen production, which is great. as an investor, I have to think about the demand side. So all this hydrogen people want to produce, well, where's it going to go? Who's going to use it? So the whole if we build it, they will come solution. It's not quite so simple for the massive amounts of capital that need to go into something like this. So as an investor, I tend to focus more of my time looking for the demand side applications of hydrogen, because I know that once the demand is there, there's plenty of opportunities for producing the fuel. Then, of course, we have technical challenges that can be overcome, but certainly need to be addressed, such as costly transmission and distribution, energy losses, commercial issues such as regional pricing, and then, of course, one of my favorite hot buttons is regulation. There's so many different regulatory bodies, at least in the US, that get involved in permitting new facilities. The more they can be coordinated across federal, state, and local lines, then the more we will be able to advance clean fuels such as hydrogen quickly to try and meet those goals in the next 10 years, not the next 30 years. Finally, the value chain, there's a lot of different places in here that there can be room for failure, but also optimization. Production here, we only talk about, sort of the forward-looking, cleaner ways of producing, hydrogen. Some is in fuel transformation, but then some may not be. Shipping, both in terms of transporting, but using hydrogen as a fuel. And then some of the end uses on an industrial scale that we see as the most promising, everything from heavy industry, such as steel and refining, to various forms of transportation, particularly heavy-duty transportation, as well as marine, and certainly the heating and power generation aspects of how hydrogen can decarbonize industries in the near term. Why don't we take a couple minutes to talk about the different ways of producing hydrogen? There are everyone hears about the different colors, so some of you may be familiar with them, but I'll go through them, kind of quickly. Gray hydrogen, that's pretty much what we have today for the most part. It's steam methane reforming or gasification of fossil fuels. The majority of it does not have any abatement of the CO2 emissions. So looking at this graph, coal gasification is really, quite, carbon intensive. Blue hydrogen is fossil fuel generation of hydrogen, but with carbon capture. And the smaller bars here are showing how much we can reduce the carbon footprint with carbon capture, say 90% from coal, or 50 or 90% from natural gas. But even with natural gas being a cleaner fuel, there's still quite a lot of hydrogen or carbon rather being produced if you're just doing SMRs without the CO2 abatement. Green hydrogen is one that is getting a lot of attention. The idea being use abundant and inexpensive renewables to generate hydrogen through electrolysis. Certainly if you're doing electrolysis through renewables or nuclear generation, you're not going to have any material CO2. But these bars are actually pretty important. If you're doing electrolysis with power from the grid, of course, on a full systems basis, you need to look at what the fuel balance is for your electricity grid, because if you're doing electrolysis using a primarily coal-fired electric grid, so electrolysis in West Virginia off of the local utilities, that's actually not very clean hydrogen. So we need to be thinking about this not just at the facility level, but in kind of the full cycle. One that I'll just mention briefly is what they're referring to as turquoise hydrogen. Not as advanced right now, but it's something that has great promise. Producing hydrogen through pyrolysis, which will still produce carbon in the process, but it comes out as a solid as opposed to in a gaseous form, and that just makes it easier to manage, store, dispose of safely, and you don't have to deal with the same level of permits and long-term monitoring and reliability that you need to do with geologic sequestration of CO2. One more slide on the cost for different methods of producing hydrogen. So as I said, green hydrogen is great, something that I think we all are very interested in. But when you think about that, you have to keep in mind the cost of producing the electricity. So, the levelized cost of electricity for producing hydrogen through electrolysis is really the biggest driver. In places like Oklahoma, Kansas, the wind belt, say desert Southwest with a lot of abundant solar. If you're producing electricity somewhere down below $20 per megawatt hour on a base load basis, well, then you're able to produce hydrogen at a rate that's cost competitive with blue hydrogen at various levels. But of course, there's not that many places where you're able to produce electricity around the clock, including firming and shaping at that level. So I do believe that there is quite an important need to be advancing blue hydrogen in the near term as a transition, while we're allowing the cost of renewables to continue to fall, so that several years from now, a lot more of the hydrogen production can be picked up by electrolysis. But I think the SMR and CCS is something that really needs to be on the table today. Talking a little bit about the sectors where hydrogen can make the most difference from an abatement point of view. Certainly, maritime transport, as well as long haul aviation, with sustainable aviation fuels, ground transport, particularly heavy duty vehicles. There's a lot of expectation that hydrogen fueled fuel cells will be a good match for long haul trucking as opposed to batteries, because electric vehicles for transportation, they're so heavy, and in terms of the amount of range and recharging time that you get with batteries versus much faster refueling time for a hydrogen powered vehicle, that's something that I think has great promise. Feedstocks for chemicals and refining, and certainly different applications where a lot of heat is required, such as iron and steel, and really centralized heating. There is actually still a great deal of centralized heating throughout the world today. Retrofitting all of that to be distributed is not as easy as it sounds. So in some cases, using hydrogen for fueling those central heating plants could be a very viable, clean, and economic solution. As far as consumption, Europe, North America, China, no surprise there. Perhaps no surprise either that it's expected that the demand for China will exceed the combined demand of both North America and Europe. But in terms of the timing, Europe is, they have more momentum for decarbonization and building hydrogen applications than really anywhere else in the world. So I think that while they may not have the biggest scale, we may see the fastest level of adoption through Europe. Just touching on a couple of the sectors that I had mentioned, in terms of shipping, hydrogen and ammonia, both for being transported on the ocean, but also as a fuel for those ships. We're seeing a lot of attention there. Maersk has been very vocal in their interest in transitioning to cleaner fuels. So I think there's great promise there. Power generation. There's a couple different ways that power generation, I think, will benefit from hydrogen. One, there are the major combustion turbine manufacturers. They are pretty close to having turbines available for commercial use that can use pretty close to 100% hydrogen. I'm aware of some projects that are in discussions with major OEMs that are getting close to doing fully guaranteed turbine supply deals to fuel on greater than 95% hydrogen. In some cases, they will address some of the metallurgical concerns with steam injection, but it is a way for them to achieve generation through combustion turbines with a very, very high level of low carbon fuel. But even before we get to that point, there's opportunities today where the majority of combustion turbines can burn up to 30% hydrogen blended in with the natural gas fuel mix. So that's an opportunity that is available today. And there is the ability for the pipeline network to accept a certain level of hydrogen without having any reliability concerns. So that's something that I think has great promise. As far as iron, steel, heat applications, I had mentioned that before. Hydrogen's a great source of providing heat energy. So I think that that's an area that's subject to transportation and storage, has very wide applications that we should pursue vigorously. Just a couple of thoughts on some of the areas that I highlighted. For marine shipping, some of the barriers, of course, are it's a conservative industry. So, how many times have we heard the cliche of, turning a large ship around in the ocean? Well, this is actually that industry. So getting them to turn their business quickly is something that is not easy, but we're seeing a lot more pull from the marine shipping industry now, including different compliance elements that they're going to have to deal with, particularly in Europe, where ships are going to be facing retrofit obligations to reduce their carbon footprint. There's a number of different ways that they will look to do that, but certainly doing a fuel switch is going to be among them. And in terms of trying to get from carbon neutral to zero carbon, there's just a spectrum of ways to do that between different synthetic fuels, and then getting to hydrogen and ammonia, which is a great carrier. Keeping in mind that marine shipping alone is 2% of global emissions, so that's quite a bit of CO2 that can be addressed, just from one part of the transportation industry. I did cover this a bit before, talking about the use of hydrogen for power generation. So again, putting it through the combustion turbine, great. Let's do that wherever we can. I think it's probably going to be at least 3 or 4 years before we see the first combustion turbine in the US that's powered entirely with hydrogen. But just as we're seeing airlines that have combustion turbines, powering the airliners, have been taking flights with 100% sustainable aviation fuel. I think we're going to start seeing a lot more trials and commercial applications of significant co-firing of hydrogen in natural gas through combustion turbines. I would not be surprised, to see press releases about that before the end of this year. So finally, I'll use this to close with what I'll call a call to action. Everyone who's tuned into this webinar has an interest in seeing hydrogen be one of the elements for advancing an energy transition. I think we all have our own level of passion about this, but everyone should consider what they can do within their own personal and professional lives, to help address this. And everyone touches at least one of these kind of three critical elements, being, policy support, the infrastructure that is, necessary for addressing the applications and production of hydrogen, and then of course, the technological aspects to, really expand scale and narrow the price gap. Coming at it from the private sector, we have $1 billion that we're committed to decarbonization, and hydrogen is a big element of that. And as we seek to raise additional funds, we'll be further advancing, our interest in hydrogen to the extent that there are other, investors who are tuned into this call. I'd encourage you to be finding the elements of hydrogen and low carbon fuels that really fit your particular investment mandate, because this is a business that is going to be great for investors, and that name your number of trillions. They say, 1 or 2 trillion a year, $5 trillion a year is what's necessary, to decarbonize the global economy. It's a great challenge, but it's also a great opportunity. And I welcome all those from academia, finance, and the public sector to join us. Thanks very much for your time today.
Thank you, James. I think we have questions, and I'm guessing also we have the panelists also having some questions. So I'm going to take the privilege to start among the floor first. If there are any questions from Dingjing or Dimitrios.
I have a couple of questions. One is related. We all know, we heard about, we're very well aware about the war in the Ukraine and Russia.
Yes.
Now, this is expected to affect the policies and the investments, I guess, that companies are going to do, as well as what the governments are going to do. So regarding the time value of carbon and so on, what is your take? What do you expect to happen there? If there is a way to predict what the effect is going to be in decarbonization after this conflict?
Yeah, no, I can certainly try and address the question directionally. Very difficult to quantify, but I'd say that, as far as the energy industry goes, I'm not seeing a material level of pullback from, the decarbonization commitments that, the major players are making. So quite a number of major oil and gas producers have, committed to, get to decarbonization levels by 2030, 2040, different levels. None of them are backing away from that. Now, of course, we all recognize that getting there is a transition. We have, tens of millions of people in Europe that rely on fuel, coming from Russia, and they have to look for alternatives. We're already seeing, quite a number of new announcements of LNG supply from the U.S. going to, going to Europe. But at the same time, we've seen a couple announcements in the last few weeks of shipments that are going to Asia, because there's great demand in Asia. I think they recognize that as LNG really is a global commodity now. If they don't get on the case and sign up their supply now, when this flood is going towards Europe, then they're going to be paying more. So I think there's going to be a lot of disruption for the next couple of years. I don't anticipate it being disruption for 5 or 10 years, but there's going to be a lot of supply deals that are signed up, particularly for LNG, over the next 12 months, I would expect. And then, of course, there's going to be a lag until that liquefaction capacity is online, and the gasification facilities and the pipeline networks, to distribute it to Europe, are in place. Now, this all, assumes that we're not, that the European countries that are trying to cut back their Russian supply aren't just going to forgive and forget, within the next couple of years. I can't give you a prediction on that, but I will say that I would not be surprised if there's going to be a bit of a delay in the carbon intensity reductions that we've been seeing in Europe, because at the end of the day, if Germany needs to, if they need to, turn back on a few more coal plants to, keep people warm this coming winter, that is something that they're obligated to do for their citizens.
Can I ask another question? A second question, and then I'll shut up. It's about, you mentioned the regulations and the situation here in the US, and then this is a little bit related to the demand. You mentioned China might overcome, might be that the demand for hydrogen there might be as much as Europe and us together, and the US together. And but how do you see this being resolved? What is there one regulation or two regulations that the US can implement or kind of look into, or do you anticipate this is going to be a state-by-state type of situation, and we will have a mosaic of regulations that will keep us essentially back relative to these other places, other markets?
It's a very complicated question. So of course, in the US, state rights are very important, but so much energy infrastructure winds up at least crossing federal lands that when you get to permitting large infrastructure facilities, particularly when they need connectivity, whether it be for fuel or electric or offtake distribution, right of way often is crossing not just state lands or privately owned lands, but federal lands. So you do get this mosaic of regulations. Certainly from a developer's point of view, having one agency to go to for all of your needs would make things much easier. But let's be honest, the state of Texas is not going to acquiesce all of its permitting authority to the EPA in Washington, D.C. So I think that the best we can hope for is coordination and consistent standards across different bodies, and within particular jurisdictions, having consistency and coordination across different state agencies. If you've ever looked at a permitting matrix for a large facility in the state of California, typically you'll find between 8 and 14 different state agencies that you need to apply to, that are all within the executive branch of the state of California, and in some cases their standards and their requirements do not line up. That's an area where we should be asking our state representatives and our executive branch in our states to really clean these things up, because it's in their power to do so, and it's not just it's not just smart business, but it's also going to attract business and tax revenue into their states.
Thank you.
Dingjing, do you want to go next? I think you have a question too.
Thank you, James. This is great. I do have a question. I wanted to hear about your thoughts. So do you think is hydrogen the missing components for a 100% carbon-free power grid? What would you think? I'd love to hear.
I'm sorry, you broke up a moment. Can you repeat it again?
I'd love to hear what you think is hydrogen the missing component for a 100% carbon-free power grid.
I think that I think hydrogen will be I think it should be and will be a significant component for a 100% carbon-free grid. It's not going to be the most economic choice in all places. Certainly, there's places where wind generation can be produced at a levelized cost, I think even less than $10, in some of the lowest cases today. I think I don't know if hydrogen will get to that point. I think it's unlikely that it will. However, because you have intermittent resources, a lot of the cheapest electric resources are intermittent. You need to have some sort of a reliable, dispatchable fuel source for firming the grid, and I think that hydrogen does have a place to do that. I think in addition to battery storage, hydrogen can be stored pretty easily, and it can be used for ancillary services and filling in the gaps between wind and solar.
Thank you, James. Very insightful thoughts. Thank you.
I'm going to take my turn too, being an economist in the room. So in terms of you mentioned the regulations, and given the different alternative forms of producing hydrogen, right? There's a big horse race right now, whichever is going to be the most dominant. Mm-hmm. And I think the main issue, many progressives on the environmental side is the hydrogen, the new Trojan horse for fossil fuel interests to find further demand for fossil fuel, right? Especially with brown and other forms of, because we use renewables, that's even with green energy, right? With green renewables for green hydrogen, use electricity, you create hydrogen, and then you use hydrogen to create electricity again, and you lose 20-30% of the power already. What are your thoughts? How much credibility do you think there are in those objections?
So from an economics point of view, and so I should be careful since I'm answering the question from an economics professor. I personally don't agree with the argument that you will be creating greater demand for fossil fuels by producing energy, in a way that on a full systems basis is lower carbon. For instance, I do work in carbon capture, usage, and sequestration. Well, the most economic use for CO2 today is enhanced oil recovery. Most environmentalists hate the idea of using CO2 to produce more oil, but you're not producing more oil, you're producing cleaner oil. And we should keep in mind that enhanced oil recovery has been going on for decades, and they've been doing it by extracting CO2 from the ground, piping it to the oil field, and then injecting it. So if we're actually capturing CO2 from industrial emitters and offsetting the extraction of CO2 from the ground, that's actually a net benefit. And I do not believe that people are going to turn their lights on anymore, or run their air conditioners any longer, or choose to buy an internal combustion car rather than an electric car, just because just because of the fossil fuel nature of where that comes from. People are going to buy what makes sense for them economically and reliably, and I'm in favor of a transition that just does that in a cleaner way sooner.
Thank you. And then we have from the floor, I want to take a couple of questions. Let me read them to you. So Carson is asking, when you are receiving and reviewing all these proposals for hydrogen production, what tends to be the biggest oversight? Are there any common mistakes?
That's a great question. Yes, I would say the most common, I won't call it a mistake, but I'll say the most common area that entrepreneurs underestimate is the demand side, which I referred to before. We see a lot of proposals for, we're going to build this new hydrogen production facility, whether it be green or blue or whatever. It's going to produce millions of tons of hydrogen a year, great clean fuel. And then from an investor point of view, I say, okay, well, who's buying that hydrogen from you? And the answers typically are not very good. The answers typically are, oh, well, it's going to be in an area where there's going to be a lot of demand. But of course, these are billion-dollar projects that require non-recourse debt to be financed. And non-recourse debt is, by its very nature, going to require long-term offtake contracts for the product with credit-worthy customers. No different than what we've seen in traditional energy industry, infrastructure projects, power generation, natural gas. These are kind of simple, kind of development project elements that are not different just because it's a newer, cleaner technology.
Thank you. And a follow-up question is from Yusuf. Do you think that green hydrogen prices are now reasonable? How do you think this may change in the near future?
Do I think they are reasonable? I think that there are certain jurisdictions where they have the potential to, where the production cost has the potential to be reasonable, but that's only part of the story. The transportation and storage of hydrogen is not a trivial cost. So I think that there needs to be greater advancements for the full cycle of production, transportation, storage, and delivery to customers, to all be done in a way where it's going to be an attractive, cost to the consumer.
Great. We are almost up time. We started late, but I think we can take from the floor. If there are from participants more questions, please do use the Q&A option to post your questions. And meanwhile, I will ask one more question from my end. Given the high degree of politicization of energy policy in the US, right? Even the energy efficient LED bulbs under Obama administration, when they were mandated, right there, and then Trump administration came and tried to reverse them. Do you expect such high volatility in the political system in the US will cause delays or lags in the speed at which both, on the business side, we move to hydrogen, but also on the demand side, as you mentioned, and Europeans are going a lot faster, it looks like, especially Germany, Britain, and other countries in Western Europe on hydrogen adoption and technologies. Do you think there's any lag, one, two, the political volatility in the US, do you think will or does create any problems, given your clients or your interactions with them?
Actually, I do not expect the volatile political climate to create too many delays. I'll give you two reasons why. One, if we look at the 4 years during the Trump administration, where, let's be honest, the Trump administration was hostile to renewable energy. But renewable energy grew quite a bit during that time because the demand from the private sector increased quite a bit. Also, the utility sector, they plan on 10-year cycles. They do not plan, on 1 or 2 year cycles. They're not focused on, who's in the White House at any given time. So I think that's one element. Something else to consider is that when we're thinking about this as a transition, and to the extent that there is room for lower carbon fossil fuel applications within the transition, that is going to bring in a lot of the people from the right. Joe Manchin, who we all hear about all the time, he loves carbon capture because it's something that can benefit West Virginia. So I think that, at least as long as, we are collectively, pursuing somewhat of a, all of the above strategy, I don't expect there to be a slowdown.
Thank you. And we have two, I think, and final questions from the floor. One is from Jaila. You mentioned that it is important to have buyers for hydrogen, but do you have any industry recommendations?
Yes. So I would say, thinking back to kind of those abatement sectors that I mentioned, transportation, heavy duty transportation. We're seeing Nikola, do that. They have already signed up, long-term contracts for hydrogen supply for some of their tractor trailers. Heat applications, which, can be, global applications. Iron and steel, that's an area where I think some of the greatest advances can be made in decarbonization. That's going to be one of the longest to catch on, but I think that it's such a tremendous amount of our global emissions that it really is worthwhile to pursue. And then I think you probably could tell how enthusiastic I am about hydrogen blending in the natural gas system for power generation. That's something we should be doing immediately.
And the last question is anonymous. Won't the hydrogen products increase demand for fuel and coal? Isn't the aim of hydrogen production to reduce carbon dioxide emissions? And how would hydrogen production do so if it increases demand for fuel and coal? And I think that comes back to also even the green hydrogen question, right? With whether it's completely carbon neutral. Wind turbines say, 30-year lifespan, and they need to be changed. So they are not completely carbon neutral. So if the consumers get the impression that now we can consume even more and it won't have any carbon footprint, that might be misleading, wouldn't it?
I think that's right. And also, to be clear, I am not advocating for hydrogen production from fossil fuels, without carbon abatement. So I think that it is very important that we avoid that headline that I mentioned this morning. And if we're going to produce hydrogen from steam methane reformation, let's make sure that there's carbon capture that's attached to it. And there are significant incentives available for investors to be supporting those projects now.
Great. I think we are out of time. Dimitrios, do you have any final?
No, I just want to apologize again for the delayed start of the session, but I want to thank James for his time and for his thoughtful answers and for his very interesting talk. Thank you.
Yes, I would like to repeat the same. Thank you, James, and thank you, the audience, for great questions. And we all apologize for the delay, but given the word of Zoom, I guess, it's not always the most reliable form of communication. Thank you again. Thank you, James.
All right. Thank you, everyone. Enjoy your afternoon.
Bye-bye.